The first shovel of snow struck the north wall of Eliza Hart's cabin, just as three riders slowed on the road to watch. Eliza packed the snow against the lower logs, then stepped back to judge the slope. She was 43, widowed, and tired of explaining work that would have been called practical if a man had done it first. One rider laughed. "You planning to bury the place before winter does?" Eliza drove the shovel in again. Her father stood in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame. Cold had settled into his knees before breakfast, and the wind beneath the floor had kept him awake most of the night. Behind him, their milk cows stamped inside the lean-to. A carpenter named Miles Turner climbed down from his wagon and pressed a glove against the sill log. "Snow against wood means water," he said. "Water means rot. It does when you put it against the wood." Eliza pointed to the narrow space beneath the sill. Two stakes marked the safe height, and the packed snow sloped away from the cabin. At its lower edge, she had cut a shallow drainage run toward the yard. Miles barely studied it. "Clear it away before you lose the wall." Her father shifted in the doorway. "Eliza, maybe we ought to listen." Those words hurt more than the laughter. She planted the shovel upright. "Cold hates stillness. I'm not sealing the cabin. I'm stopping the wind before it gets underneath us." Her late husband had learned the method from trappers north of the Platte. They shaped snow, kept it below the sill, and gave meltwater somewhere to go. Eliza had watched him do it twice. After his death, she began studying where frost gathered along her floorboards and where loose powder disappeared beneath the cabin. This winter, she had written it down. She returned from inside with an oilcloth ledger, a spirit thermometer, and 4 red wool strips cut from an old scarf. Kneeling beside the north wall, she tied one strip beneath a loose floor edge. The wool pulled inward at once. Eliza placed the thermometer on the floor near that wall and waited. Outside, the air stood at 8 degrees. The floor beside the north logs measured 19. She wrote both numbers in the clean first column. Miles folded his arms. "Numbers won't keep a house dry." "No," Eliza said, "work might—" She packed the remaining section in short layers, pressing each one with the flat of the shovel. She stopped twice to clear the drainage cut and once to confirm that the breathing gap remained open. By the time she finished, her gloves were soaked and one knuckle had split. She tied a second wool strip beside the first. The old ribbon still pulled inward, but less sharply. The new one trembled only when a strong gust crossed the flats. Her father stepped down and crouched beside her. He watched the ribbons, then held his hand near the gap. "There's less air," he said. Eliza nodded, but the proof brought little relief. The north wall had been the easier side. The west foundation remained exposed, and that was where the evening wind usually struck hardest. Miles looked toward the horizon. The humor had left his face. A gray band spread beneath the clouds. Eliza checked the outside thermometer again. 6 degrees. Then 5. Loose snow began sliding sideways across the flats. The riders stopped laughing. Eliza lifted her face into the wind and felt it strike her left cheek instead of her right. The direction had changed. Behind her, the finished north berm held steady. Across the cabin, the unfinished west wall gave a low wooden groan as the first hard gust found the open foundation. The west wind lifted powder from the yard and drove it beneath the cabin in pale, twisting sheets. Eliza crossed to the exposed wall and dropped to one knee. The red wool strip beneath the west floor edge streamed inward, as though someone inside were pulling it by a thread. Her father watched from the doorway. That much air was under us all night. More when the wind stayed west. Jonah Reed rode in from the south pasture before Eliza could answer. At 55, he knew a falling temperature by the way horses lowered their heads. He dismounted and studied the bank along the north wall. "I heard you were stacking snow against the house." "I'm shaping it. Miles says it will hold water." "Miles knows walls. I know where this wind goes." Eliza drove 2 stakes beside the west wall and stretched a cord between them several inches below the sill. The line marked the highest point the snow could reach. She packed the base firmly, but kept the upper edge loose enough to settle without pressing against the logs. Jonah crouched beside her. "You're leaving a hollow behind it. A breathing space. That lets cold in. It lets the wood dry. The snow stops the wind before it reaches the gap." She laid split willow branches beneath the lower edge of the bank, their open sides facing the yard. Meltwater would have a path away from the cabin instead of pooling beneath it. Her father looked at the willow. And if those fill, then I clear them. Eliza built slowly. Every few feet, she pushed the shovel handle beneath the cord to confirm that the sill space remained open. Jonah carried snow from the yard, but when he raised one load too high, Eliza knocked the top away. Below the line, it would block more wind higher. It would touch the wood. Jonah lowered the shovel. Your wall. My cabin. The answer came sharper than she intended. Yet Jonah only nodded and followed her measurement. Near midday, he pointed to a dark mark on a wooden spacer beneath the west corner. There's your water. Her father stepped closer. The stain looked damning against the pale wood. Eliza did not argue. She opened a narrow inspection cut through the berm, exposing the breathing gap in the sill behind it. The outer spacer was damp. The sill log was dry. Eliza ran her bare fingertips along the wood and held them out for Jonah. Melt from the working snow. It reached the spacer, not the cabin. Jonah touched the sill himself. His expression changed, though only slightly. Eliza snuffed a candle and held the smoking wick near the exposed gap. The gray trail bent sharply beneath the northwest corner. There, the wind was not entering across the whole wall. It was being drawn through one narrow opening where the ground dipped beneath the foundation. She cut away only that section, reset the willow beneath it, and packed the snow lower and wider. The rest of the berm stayed in place. When she tested the smoke again, it lifted almost straight upward. Her father placed his palm on the floor inside. Warmer than this morning. Jonah looked at the stakes, dry sill, and untouched section Eliza had refused to dismantle. You planned for the wet, he said. I planned to look for it. Eliza carried warm water outside and poured it into the upper end of the willow drainage run. Nothing came out in the yard. She tried again. The water vanished beneath the snow, but the channel remained silent. Eliza pushed a narrow stick into the opening. It stopped against something hard less than a foot inside. The drainage path had frozen solid beneath the berm. Eliza drew the stick back, its tip glazed with ice. Water from her test had reached a bend where powder had settled, then frozen into a plug. If she left it, any thaw would send meltwater sideways toward the foundation. Jonah fetched an iron bar from his saddle roll. Eliza stopped him before he struck the berm. You break through blind, you could lift the whole bank. What do you use, then? Patience. She cut a square opening in the outer crust with the shovel edge, removing thin blocks instead of driving through them. Beneath the shell, the packed layers remained firm but workable. She followed the willow channel by hand and found that it had sagged beneath the snow. Eliza replaced the narrow branch with a thicker split limb, its flat side braced on two stones. She widened the downhill end so slush could pass, then rebuilt the bank in staggered layers rather than one solid mass. Jonah watched her hands. You leave seams on purpose, enough to keep it from turning into ice. The repair forced her to strip nearly 6 feet of snow from the west corner. The instant the base opened, the red wool ribbon beneath the floor snapped toward the cabin. Inside, her father's chair scraped across the boards. That draft reached the stove. He called. Jonah crouched beside the gap and held his glove near it. Wind poured over his knuckles. For the first time, he looked less like a man humoring a widow and more like a rancher studying a weakness in his own barn. Tell me where to put the next load. Eliza pointed to the cord. Low first. Pack the outside edge harder. Don't cross that line. Jonah carried blocks from the drift near the lean-to. Twice he started too high, and twice he lowered them when Eliza tapped the mark. They rebuilt the corner with a broad base facing the wind. Eliza preserved the sill gap, reset the drainage limb, and cut a shallow groove down the outer slope. When she poured warm water into the upper end, it emerged in the yard carrying grains of ice. Her father released a quiet breath from the doorway. Eliza moved the thermometer to the west corner for a second reading. That board remained colder, but it no longer felt like open ground beneath a roof. Her father rubbed one heel across it, testing the place where frost usually whitened the nail heads. No frost had formed. The change was small, yet it belonged to the snow, the open sill gap, and the work not to chance. Eliza retied the frayed west ribbon and set the spirit thermometer on the floor beside the north wall. Outside, the reading held near 7 degrees. They waited for the stove's burn to settle. The floor measured 29. Eliza checked twice before entering it in the ledger. That morning, the same board had measured 19. The stove was no hotter, and the wind had not weakened. Her father crossed toward the north wall. Usually he stopped halfway and braced against the table until the pain eased. This time he reached the chair without pausing and placed both feet flat on the floor. "Still cold," he said, "but it isn't biting." Jonah stood in the doorway, snow melting across his shoulders. He glanced from the ledger to the quiet ribbon beneath the boards. Miles was right about snow wetting wood, and I was right to leave room for it not to. Jonah nodded. There was no apology in it, but there was attention. By afternoon, a softer south wind loosened snow along the roof edge. Water dripped onto the berm. Eliza cleared the drainage exits twice and marked each damp patch in the ledger. Then the sky cleared. The temperature fell so quickly that the wet surface hardened before dark. A sharp crack sounded along the west wall. Eliza raised the lantern and found a black line beneath the frozen shell. The crust had pulled away from the softer bank, leaving a hollow space between them. The red ribbon beneath the northwest corner stretched inward again. The thaw had opened a wind tunnel aimed directly beneath the cabin. The black hollow beneath the frozen shell was wider than Eliza had expected. She slid the lantern along the west wall and watched the red ribbon pull toward the gap. The outer crust looked solid from the yard, but the thaw had softened the lower layers before the sudden freeze sealed them over. Wind now traveled behind the hard surface like water through a ditch. Jonah reached for the shovel. "All of it?" he asked. "Only what has separated?" Eliza tapped the shell with the wooden handle. A dull sound marked snow still bonded to the slope. A sharper knock showed where the crust had lifted away. She cut those sections into blocks and removed them one at a time. Jonah carried each slab aside while she tested the bank beneath it. Where the lower snow remained firm, she left it. Where the thaw had carved a channel, she opened the space to the ground. The work exposed the breathing gap again. Cold air rushed beneath the floor, and her father shut the inner door against the draft. Jonah lowered a load near the sill. "Below the cord," Eliza said. "I know. You forgot twice yesterday." "I remember twice yesterday." He adjusted the shovel before she could touch it. They rebuilt outward from the base, not upward from the wall. Eliza packed the first layers firmly, then left the outer layers looser so they could settle without becoming one slab of ice. She reset the willow drain and carved a deeper run toward the yard. When she poured water through it, a thin stream appeared below the bank. The ribbon inside slowed. Eliza was entering the result in her ledger when wagon wheels creaked along the road. Miles Turner stopped beside the cabin with two ranchers behind him. He took in the dismantled snow, the exposed spacer, and the damp streak near the corner. "There it is," he said, "water already against the house." "The spacer is wet," Eliza answered, "and the sill isn't." Miles stepped down but did not inspect the gap. One rancher stared at the broken shell scattered across the yard. "Looks like the whole thing failed." A thaw lifted the crust. "I'm rebuilding the damaged section." Before the real cold, Miles asked, "You'd be safer clearing it." Eliza closed the ledger. Clearing it would leave the wind an open road beneath the floor. Miles shook his head and drove on. The two ranchers followed, carrying his warning farther than any measurement Eliza had written. By lamplight, Jonah helped her finish the last slope. The west ribbon moved only during the strongest gusts. Eliza's father crossed the north side without bracing against the table and set his chair where the floor had been coldest. Inside, the cabin smelled of beans, coffee, and damp wool. Jonah sat at the table while Eliza's father divided the cornbread. "I thought she was being stubborn. Her father said—" Jonah looked at Eliza. "She is—" Eliza gave him a flat stare. "She's also right about the gap," he added. The old man smiled into his cup. For several minutes, nobody argued about snow, wood, or what a widow ought to know. Jonah described a calf that had learned to open a gate latch. Her father claimed the animal had better sense than most men on the flats. Eliza laughed before she could stop herself. It was a small sound, but the room changed around it. Jonah glanced toward the north wall. "Warmer here than my kitchen." "That is because your kitchen door hangs crooked. I came to help, not be insulted." "You came skeptical." "I can do both." After supper, her father rested both boots flat on the boards and did not draw them toward the stove. Then hoofbeats struck hard outside. A young rider dismounted with frost whitening his scarf. He carried a warning from the telegraph station east of the flats. Temperatures north of them had fallen faster than forecast, and the cold front was expected before the following night. Eliza stepped into the yard with the lantern. Half of the west berm still needed its final packing. The newly cut drainage channels were already glazing at their edges. Behind her, the unfinished slope gave a faint settling crack. The hardest cold of the winter was coming before her repairs had time to set. By dawn, the unfinished west slope had hardened into ridges beneath a skin of ice. Eliza carried the ledger outside beneath her coat and drove the shovel edge into the inspection section Miles had questioned. Jonah arrived as she loosened the first block. Her father remained in the doorway while Miles approached with the same two ranchers who had seen the broken crust. "You sent for us," Miles asked. "I sent word that you could look." Eliza removed the outer block and brushed loose snow away. The damp spacer appeared first. Behind it, several inches of open air remained beneath the marked sill line. She held the lantern close. The sill log was pale, dry, and firm. Miles pressed his thumb against it, then pushed a knife blade into the seam where rot would have softened the wood. "The sill is dry," he said. One rancher pointed to the spacer. "Then why is that wet?" "It catches what the snow releases before it reaches the cabin." Eliza lifted the board from its notch. Water had darkened the outer face, but the back remained nearly dry. Miles studied the breathing gap in willow drain. "You solved today's moisture," he said. "That does not solve tomorrow's freeze. This bank could lock solid, your drains may stop, and you will not know what is trapped behind it. I'll know if the sill changes. You may know too late." Her father looked from the exposed wood to the gray sky. "Would it be safer to clear the snow until the cold passes?" "No. The cold is why it has to stay." Miles rose. "You have tested pieces of it, not 30 degrees below zero." The ranchers offered to clear both walls before dusk. Eliza refused. She replaced the spacer, marked the inspection point, and closed the opening to the same measurements. Miles left without mockery. That made his warning carry farther. There is a hard kind of loneliness in knowing something others cannot yet see. Doubt sounds sensible when it comes from many mouths, and truth can feel reckless when only one person is willing to stand beside it. Have you ever had to trust careful work before anyone else believed the result? Eliza watched the wagons disappear, then opened the damaged west bank back to stable layers. She cut the outer slope lower and broader so the coming wind would climb it instead of striking a vertical face. Jonah widened the drainage exits with split willow and set flat stones above them to keep the snow's weight from crushing the channels. At the northwest corner, Eliza pushed smoke beneath the sill. The gray trail rose and stayed close to the wall. "No pull," Jonah said. "Not there." 6 feet south, the smoke bent toward a shallow hollow beneath the ground line. Eliza removed 2 packed blocks, filled the dip, and rebuilt the surface. Her gloves stiffened as the temperature fell. When she opened the ledger, meltwater from her sleeve crossed the lower corner. Ink spread through 3 readings. She pressed the page with her cuff, but the figures blurred into blue-gray stains. The oilcloth cover tore beside the binding when she forced it closed. Jonah held out his hand. "Give it to me before you ruin the rest." Eliza hesitated, then passed him the ledger. He tucked it inside his coat without opening it. The rebuilt west ribbon moved only during the strongest gusts. Eliza poured warm water into each drain. Both released thin streams before the water froze. Inside, the north floor remained warmer than the boards near the door. Her father stood without gripping the table, but his eyes stayed on Eliza, waiting for certainty she could not honestly give. The work had answered Miles's immediate warning, but it had cost most of the remaining daylight. Near sunset, Eliza placed the spirit thermometer outside the north wall. The red line sank below the mark from the previous winter's coldest morning. Her father called from inside. "The floor's holding." Eliza stepped toward the north berm. A sound like cloth tearing came from beneath the crust. A narrow crack appeared near the northwest corner and traveled across the packed snow 1 inch at a time. It passed the first stake, split around the inspection point, and kept moving toward the center of the wall. The cold had begun breaking the berm before night arrived. Eliza knelt beside the traveling crack and pressed one gloved hand against the frozen crust. The split had crossed nearly half the north berm, but the snow beneath it did not sound the same everywhere. Near the northwest corner, her shovel handle struck a hollow note. Closer to the center, the packed layers answered with a dull, solid thump. She marked 3 places with charcoal on the sill stakes. Surface break here, she said. Separation here, and something worse at the corner. Jonah returned the ledger from inside his coat. The torn cover had dried stiff, and several figures were blurred. But the earlier floor readings remained legible. Tell me what you need. Eliza cut a narrow inspection opening at the first mark. The crust had split, but the bank beneath it remained tight. She packed loose powder into the seam and tamped it with the wooden paddle. At the second mark, the shell had lifted away from the slope. She removed the broken piece, trimmed the edge back to stable snow, and rebuilt it lower. The northwest corner was different. When Eliza opened the third cut, a ribbon of cold air slid beneath her sleeve. The ground dipped there, and the refrozen shell had bridged across it, leaving a hidden pocket between the bank and the earth. Jonah crouched beside her. Clear the whole side. If we clear it now, the wind gets every foot of foundation. If we leave it, we brace the weak places and keep watching. Her father had come outside wrapped in a blanket. Miles would say, "Take it down." Miles isn't sleeping on that floor. The words came too hard. Eliza lowered her voice. I can remove it, but then I know what happens. The draft comes back before dark. Her father stared at the crack, then at the dry sill visible through the inspection gap. What do your records say? He asked. The bank works when the gap stays open and the drains stay clear. Then do that. He simply stepped away from the wall and gave the decision back to her. Eliza rebuilt the corner with angled blocks cut from the last loose drift beside the lean-to. Jonah carried them one at a time. She set each block below the sill line, packed the outer face, and left the inner breathing space untouched. By the fourth block, only a shallow ridge of usable snow remained in the yard. If another section goes tonight, Jonah said, we won't have much left. Then we place what we have where the wind will need it. Eliza prepared 2 spare blocks near the northwest corner and covered them with loose powder so they would not freeze to the ground. She laid both shovels beside the door, set the wooden paddle under the eave, and placed split willow drains, flat stones, and sill clearance stakes within reach. Inside, she tied fresh red wool strips beneath 3 floor sections. One hung at the north wall, one at the northwest corner, and one near the door as a comparison. The older west ribbon was frayed almost through. She set the spirit thermometer beside her father's chair and copied the surviving readings onto the driest page of the damaged ledger. Jonah, she said, bring Miles at sunrise, whether it holds or not, especially if it doesn't. Jonah looked toward the darkening flats. I can stay. You can stay to carry what I tell you, not to rebuild it your way. A faint smile touched his mouth. Your cabin, my work. Her father moved his bedroll from near the stove to the north wall. Eliza stopped him. You do not have to prove anything. I'm not proving it. He lowered himself carefully. I'm sleeping where the floor is warm. That trust frightened her more than his doubt had. If the berm failed, the cold would reach him first. Night settled without moonlight. The thermometer fell past 0, then lower. Eliza checked the drains each hour and touched the sill through the marked inspection opening. Dry wood, open gap, still ribbons. Near midnight, the wind went quiet. Jonah lifted his head from the chair. The stove flame leaned suddenly toward the northwest wall. A hard gust struck the cabin, followed by the deep cracking sound of weight giving way. Outside, packed snow broke from the corner and slid into the yard. The northwest ribbon snapped straight beneath the floor. Eliza opened the door and raised the lantern. Where the berm had stood, a black gap now exposed the foundation beneath her father's room to the full force of the wind. The wind struck the open corner hard enough to scatter loose snow across the yard. Eliza dropped beside the foundation with the lantern shielded under her coat. The gap looked broad from the doorway, but the red ribbon beneath the floor showed the strongest pull near the ground dip she had found that afternoon. Hold the light low, she told Jonah. He knelt beside her, one hand cupped around the flame. Eliza pushed the wooden paddle into the opening. The top of the breathing space was still clear. The failure had begun below it, where the hardened shell had lost its support and slid outward. Bring the willow and 1 flat stone. Jonah reached for the nearest snow block as well. Not yet. Her father called from inside. The floor is turning colder. Eliza placed the split willow along the lowest edge of the opening and braced it with the stone. The drain had to remain open even after the repair froze. She cleared loose snow away from the sill line, then held the lantern flame near the ground. It bent sharply toward one narrow notch. "That is the road," she said. She packed loose powder into the ground dip first, working it beneath the collapsed edge without raising the bank against the logs. Jonah carried the smaller prepared block and set it where she pointed. The block slid the moment he released it. Jonah caught it with both hands. "I can hold it while you pack." "No, let it go. It will open the gap wider. If you force it upward, it will close the breathing space." He released the block. It settled into the yard and broke along one corner. Eliza cut a step into the frozen base with the shovel blade. The first strike bounced away. The second chipped a shallow shelf. By the sixth, her hands had gone numb through the wet gloves. Jonah took the shovel. She held onto the handle. Same depth, no higher. He cut only where she marked. Eliza reset the damaged block at a lower angle, locking its base into the shelf. She wedged the broken corner beneath its outer edge, then packed snow behind it with the paddle. The block held. A gust struck the wall. The repair shifted half an inch but did not climb. Eliza added the second block beside it and shaped the outer face into a long slope pointed northwest. She left the top below the cord line and pressed 2 fingers through the inspection gap until she touched dry air beneath the sill. "Inside," she told Jonah, "watch the ribbons." He returned moments later. The one by the door is moving. The northwest one is slowing. Eliza capped the repair with loose powder instead of hard-packed snow. The wind pressed it into the seams. Frost began binding the surface almost at once. Inside, the frayed northwest ribbon trembled, pulled once, then dropped nearly still. Eliza set the thermometer beside her father's bedroll. The floor temperature had fallen during the collapse, but remained above freezing. She marked the figure in the damaged ledger, pressing lightly so the brittle page would not tear. Her father opened his eyes. "You closed it. For now. That is enough for now." The cold deepened through the remaining hours. Eliza checked the repair after every hard gust. The willow drain stayed open. The sill remained dry. The north ribbon barely moved, while the comparison ribbon near the unprotected door pulled steadily inward. At the lowest outside reading, the spirit thermometer stood near 31 degrees below zero. The protected floor never crossed below freezing. Across the flats, doors opened and closed as families fed their stoves again. Wind still whistled beneath the nearest ranch house. At Eliza's cabin, the stove burned at its ordinary rate, and no frost crept over the nail heads beside her father's bed. The difference could be heard before it could be measured. Her father slept through the hour that had usually driven pain into his knees. Just before sunrise, the wind weakened. Pale light spread across the flats, revealing neighboring cabins rimmed with frost along their lower boards. Jonah rode out and returned with Miles and 2 ranchers carrying their own stiff wool strips. Miles did not speak as Eliza led them to the marked inspection section. The cabin was warm. The ribbons were nearly still, but the final answer waited behind the snow, where no one could yet see whether the sill had survived the night dry. Eliza set the lantern beside the marked section and cut through the outer crust with the shovel edge. No one spoke while she removed the first block. The sacrificial spacer appeared dark on its outer face, just as it had before the freeze. Behind it, the breathing gap remained open. Eliza brushed away loose crystals and exposed the sill log. Miles pulled off one glove. He pressed his palm against the wood, then tested the lower seam with his knife blade. The sill was cold, but it was dry and firm. "No trapped water," he said. Eliza pointed to the willow drain beneath the bank. A thin line of frost marked where moisture had passed outward and frozen beyond the cabin instead of against it. One of the ranchers knelt near the northwest corner. He held his strip of wool beneath Eliza's floor edge. It hung almost still. Then he showed the strip he had brought from his own cabin. Frost had stiffened it in a hard curve from hours of steady inward pull. Jonah laid the 2 strips beside Eliza's frayed red ribbon. The difference needed no speech. Miles looked along the stakes, the low slope, and the open sill line. "I warned you about a danger you had already allowed for. It was still a danger." "Yes," he replaced his glove. "But you understood it better than I did." Eliza's father came to the doorway without the blanket around his shoulders. He stepped onto the north side of the floor and stood there easily. "I slept," he said. "I was afraid because the valley sounded certain. not because your work looked careless. It was the apology Eliza had not known she needed. More than that, it was trust returned without conditions. The men did not cheer, they began asking questions. How low should the snow remain beneath the sill? How wide should the base be? Which side of a cabin needed the steeper slope? How often should the drains be opened after a thaw? Eliza answered only what the work had proven. She warned them that loose snow piled carelessly against logs could still cause damage. The protection came from shaping, measuring, inspecting, and leaving the wood room to breathe. Miles offered straight boards from his shop for clearance guides. Jonah asked whether she would mark the safe line around his ranch house. I'll mark it, Eliza said. You'll build it the way I show you. Jonah's mouth lifted at one corner. Your work. By afternoon, stakes stood around 3 neighboring cabins. Men who had laughed from the road now carried snow where Eliza directed. They lowered blocks when they crossed her cord line and reopened every drain she marked. Her damaged ledger rested on the table beside the stove. The cover had split, several entries had blurred, and the final page carried a smudge from her frozen glove. The numbers that mattered remained readable. Near the north wall, the last red ribbon hung frayed and motionless. Her father sat above it with both boots flat on the floor. Outside, the milk cow rested behind the protected wall, while Jonah shaped a west-facing slope under Eliza's instructions. The opening image had been a widow working alone while the valley laughed. Now the same snow stood where she had told it to stand, and the valley had learned to listen. By winter's end, no one said Eliza Hart had buried her cabin. They said she had taught the snow where to stand.